Hello, Gem. I think it's just Gem. Hi, Gem. How is my sound? Am I audible? Is there a ridiculous amount of sound from my laptop in the background? I put the content warnings in the stream, which are good. I am audible. Good. Right. Excellent. Thank you. I can probably turn the sound up a bit if I need to, but if I'm good for now, then I'll carry on. Just Gem. Yeah, just Gem. Right. So the two stories for this evening are Dennis Etchison's It Only Comes Out at Night and Dracula's Chair by Peter Tremayne. Both are a reasonably short length, so I should be able to do both this evening. We're getting to near the end of the book, which of course is The Giant Book of Vampires, edited by Stephen Jones. Look, there are two of them. There we go. So as we get to the end of the book, they start to be very long ones. So when I get to those, there's three quite long ones at the end, especially Yellow Fog, which is very long and also very cool. So those ones I'll probably read on their own, or I'll read them. Like the very last one in the book is a short poem by Neil Gaiman, which presumably I can just tack onto the end of Red Rain. But those, if they're extremely long, I probably won't. I'll probably split them up or something. Right, without any further ado, I shall start on Dennis Etchison's It Only Comes Out at Night. I don't think I've ever written a vampire story, said Dennis Etchison, and he might be right. However, It Only Comes Out at Night, as the title indicates, could be a vampire story, as it's one of my favourite pieces of fiction by one of America's foremost short story writers. I decided to include it here anyway. Etchison made his first professional sale in 1961, since when he has been published in a wide variety of magazines and anthologies. His short fiction has been collected in The Dark Country, Red Dreams and The Blood Kiss, and he's written several film and television scripts, 5 novels, 3 under a pseudonym, and edited a handful of anthologies. A new novel and anthology are forthcoming. If you leave LA by way of San Bernardino, headed for Route 66 and points east, you must cross the Mojave Desert. Even after Needles and the border, however, there is no relief. The dry air only thins further as the long, relentless climb continues in earnest. Flagstaff is still almost 200 miles, and Winslow, Gallup and Albuquerque are too many hours away to think of making without food, rest, and, mercifully, sleep. It is like this. The car runs hot, hotter than it has ever before. The plies of the tires expand and contract until the sidewalls begin to shimmy slightly as they spin on over the miserable Arizona roads, giving up a faint odour like burning hair from between the treads, as the windshield colours over with essence of honeybee, wasp, dragonfly, mayfly, junebug, ladybug and the like, and the radiator, clotted with the bodies of countless kamikaze insects, hisses like a moribund lizard in the sun. All of which means, of course, that if you're travelling that way between May and September, you move by night. Only by night. For there are, after all, dawn check-in motels, do not disturb signs for bungalow doorknobs. There are diners for mid-afternoon breakfasts, coffee by the carton. There are 24-hour filling stations, bright as dreams. Whiting Brothers, Conoco, Terrible Herbst. Their flags as unfamiliar as their names, with ice machines, soda machines, candy machines, and there are the sudden unexpected rest areas just off the highway, with brick bathrooms and showers and electrical outlets, constructed especially for those weary, out of money, behind schedule. So Maclay had to learn the hard way. He slid his hands to the bottom of the steering wheel and peered ahead into the darkness, trying to relax. But the wheel stuck to his fingers like warm candy. Off somewhere to his left, the horizon flickered with pearly luminescence, and then faded again to black. This time, he did not bother to look. Sometimes, though, he wondered just how far away the lightning was striking. Not once during the night has the sound of its thunder reached him here in the car. In the back seat, his wife moaned. The trip out had turned all but unbearable for her. 4 days it had taken instead of the expected 2.5. He made a great effort not to think of it, but the memory hung over the car like a thunderhead. It had been a blur, a fever dream. Once on the second day he'd been passed by a churning bus, its silver sides blinding him, until he noticed a Mexican woman in one of the window seats. She was not looking at him. She was holding a swooning infant to the glass, squeezing water onto its head from a plastic baby bottle to keep it from passing out. Maclay sighed and fingered the buttons on the car radio. He knew he would get nothing from the AM or FM bands, not out here, but he clicked it on anyway. He left the volume and tone controls down so as not to wake Evie. Then he punched the seldom-used middle button, the shortwave band, and raised the gain carefully until he could barely hear the radio over the hum of the tyres. Static. Slowly he swept the tuner across the bandwidth, but there was only white noise. It reminded him a little of the summer rain yesterday, starting back, the way it had sounded bouncing off the windows. He was about to give up when he caught a voice, crackling, drifting in and out. He worked the knob like a safecracker, zeroing in on the signal. A few bars of music, a tone, then the voice again. Greenwich Mean Time. Not now, it isn't, MBST. Then the station ID. It was the Voice of America Overseas broadcast. He grunted disconsolately and killed it. His wife stirred. "Why'd you turn it off?" she murmured. "I was listening to that. Good program." "Take it easy," he said. "Easy, you're still asleep. We'll be stopping soon." "Only comes out at night," he heard her say, and then she was lost again in the blankets. He pressed the glove compartment, took out one of the Automobile Club guides. It was already clipped open. Maclay flipped on the overhead light and drove with one hand, reading over, for the 100th time, the list of motels that lay ahead. He knew the list by heart, but seeing the names again reassured him somehow. Besides, it helped to break the monotony. Now, I have been in the car driving down those roads in Arizona, and they are immensely boring until you get to very cool scenery. And then it's boring again, and they're just long and straight and tedious and extremely hot. So I entirely empathise with this guy. It was the kind of place you never expect to find in the middle of a long night. A bright place with buildings. Well, a building at least. And cars, other cars drawn off the highway to be together in the protective circle of light. A rest area. He would have spotted it without the sign. Elevated sodium vapor lighting bathed the scene in an almost peach-coloured glow. Hi, Zoe. I have, yes, I went on holiday to Arizona. We went on holiday to San Diego. And then we did a drive around places like Death Valley and, Tumpisha, I should say, which is, I think is what the Shoshone call it, and the Grand Canyon, that sort of thing. He would have spotted it without the sign. Elevated sodium vapor lighting bathed the scene in an almost peach-coloured glow, strikingly different from the cold blue-white sentinels of the interstate highway. He had seen other rest area signs on the way out, probably even this one. But in daylight, the signs had meant nothing more to him than Frontage Road, or Business District next right. Yeah, the Grand Canyon is pretty impressive, to be honest, unsurprisingly. He wondered if the peculiar warmth of light that made the small island of Blacktop appear so... We wondered if it was the peculiar warmth of light that made the small island of Blacktop appear so inviting. Maclay decelerated, downshifted, and left Interstate 40. The car dipped and bumped, and he was aware of the new level of sound from the engine as it geared down for the first time in hours. He eased in next to a Pontiac Firebird, towed the emergency brake, and cut the ignition. He allowed his eyes to close and his head to sink back into the headrest at last. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. It was deafening. His ears literally began to ring with the high-pitched whine of a late-night TV test pattern. The second thing he noticed was a tingling at the tip of his tongue. It brought to mind a picture of a snake's tongue, picking up electricity from the air, he thought. The third was the rustling awake of his wife in the back. She pulled herself up. "Are we sleeping now? Why are the lights?" He saw the outline of her head in the mirror. "It's just a rest stop, honey. The car needs a break." Well, it was true, wasn't it? "You want the restroom? There's one back there. See it?" "Oh my God." "What's the matter now?" "Legs asleep. Listen, are we or are we not going to get a... There's a motel coming up." He didn't say that they wouldn't hit the one he'd marked in the book for another couple of hours. He didn't want to argue. He knew she needed the rest. He needed it too, didn't he? "Think I'll have some more of that coffee, though," he said. "Isn't any more," she yawned. The door slammed. Now he was able to recognize the ringing in his ears for what it was, the sound of his own blood. It almost succeeded in replacing the steady drone of the car. He twisted around, fishing over the back of the seat for the ice chest. There should be a couple of Cokes left, at least. His fingers brushed the basket next to the chest, riffling the edges of maps and tour books, by now reshuffled haphazardly over the first aid kit he had packed himself. Tourniquet, forceps, scissors, ammonia inhalants, methylate, triangular bandage, compress, adhesive bandages, tannic acid. And the fire extinguisher, the extra carton of cigarettes, the remainder of a half a gallon of drinking water, the thermos, which Effie said was empty, and why would she lie? He popped the top of a cab. Through the side window, he saw Evie disappearing around the corner of the building. She was wrapped to the gills in her blanket. He opened the door and slid out, his back aching. He stood there blankly, the unnatural light washing over him. He took a long, sweet pull from the can. Then he started walking. The Firebird was empty. And the next car. And the next. Each car he passed looked like the one before it, which seemed crazy until he realised that it must be the work of the light. It cast an even, eerie tan over the baked metal tops, like orange sunlight through air thick with suspended particles. Even the windshields appeared to be filmed over with a thin layer of settled dust. It made him think of country roads and sundowns. He walked on. He heard his footsteps echo with surprising clarity, resounding down the staggered line of parked vehicles. Finally it dawned on him, and now he knew how really tired he must be, that the cars must actually have people in them, sleeping people. Of course. Well, hell, he thought, watching his step, I wouldn't want to wake anyone. The poor devils. Besides the sound of his footsteps, there was only the distant swish of an occasional, very occasional car on the highway. From here, even that was a distant hush, growing and then subsiding like waves on a nearby shore. He reached the end of the line, turned back. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw, or thought he saw, a movement by the building. It would be Evie shuffling back. He heard the car door slam. He recalled something he'd seen in one of the tourist towns in New Mexico. Circling the park, in Taos, that was where they had been, he'd glimpsed an ageless Indian, wrapped in typical blanket, ducking out of sight into the doorway of a gift shop, with the blanket over his head that way. The Indian had somehow resembled an Arab, or so it seemed to him at the time. He heard another car door slam. That was the same day. Was it only last week that she had noticed the locals driving with their headlights on? In honour of something or other, some regional election, perhaps. My face speaks for itself, drawled Herman J. Fascio Trujillo, candidate for sheriff. She had insisted at first that it must be a funeral procession, though for whom she could not guess. Maclay came to the car, stretched a last time, and crawled back in. Evie was bundled safely again in the back seat. He lit a quick cigarette, expecting to hear her voice any second, complaining, demanding that he roll down the windows at least, and so forth. But as it turned out, he was able to sit undisturbed, as he smoked it down almost to the filter. Paguate, Blue Water, Thoreau. He blinked. Claghetto, Joseph City, Ash Fork. He blinked and tried to focus his eyes from the taillights a half-mile ahead to the bug-spattered glass, and then back again. Petrified Forest National Park. He blinked, refocusing, but it did no good. A twitch started on the side of his face, close by the corner of his eye. Rehoboth. He strained at the road sign, the names and mileages, but instead a seemingly endless list of past and future shops and detours shimmered before his mind's eye. I've had it, he thought. Now suddenly it was catching up with him, the hours of repressed fatigue. He felt it rushing out of something from his chest. No way to make that motel. Hell, I can't even remember the name of it now. Check the book. But it doesn't matter, the eyes. Can't control my eyes anymore. He had already begun to hallucinate things like tree trunks and cows and Mack trucks speeding towards him on the highway. The cow had been straddling the broken line. In the last few minutes, its lowing, deep and regular, had become almost inviting. Well, he could try for any motel, whatever turned up next. But how much farther would that be? He ground his teeth together, feeling the pulsing at his temples. He struggled to remember the last sign. The next town, it might be a mile, 5 miles, 50. Think, he thought it, he didn't know which. If he could just pull over right now and lie down for a few minutes. He seemed to see clear ground ahead. No rocks, no ditch, the shoulder just ahead. Without thinking, he dropped into neutral and coasted, aiming for it. The car glided to a stop. God, he thought. He forced himself to turn and reach into the back seat. The lid to the chest was already off. He dipped his fingers into the ice and retrieved 2 half-melted cubes, lifted them into the front seat and began rubbing them over his forehead. He let his eyes close, seeing dull lights fire as he daubed at the lids, the rest of his face, the forehead again. As he slipped the ice into his mouth and chewed it, it broke apart as easily as snow. He took a deep breath and he opened his eyes again. At that moment a huge tanker roared past, slamming an aftershock of air into his side of the car. It rocked like a boat at sea. No, it was no good. So he could always turn back, couldn't he? And why not? The rest area was only 25 minutes behind him. Was that all? He could pull out and hang a U and turn back, just like that, and then sleep. It would be safer there. With luck, Evie wouldn't even know. An hour's rest, maybe 2, that was all he would need. Unless, was there another rest area ahead? How soon? He knew that the second wind he felt now wouldn't last, not for more than a few minutes. No, it wasn't worth the chance. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Evie was still down, a lumpen mound of blanket and hair. Above her body, behind the rear window, the raised headlights of another monstrous truck closing ground fast. He made the decision. He slid into first, swung out in a wide arc, well ahead of the blast of the truck, and worked up to fourth gear. He was thinking about the warm, friendly lights he had left behind. He angled in next to the Firebird and cut the lights. He started to reach for a pillow from the back, but why bother? It would probably wake Evie anyway. He wadded up his jacket, jammed it against the passenger armrest, and lay down. First he crossed his arms over his chest, then behind his head. Then he gripped his hands between his knees. Then he was on his back again, his hands at his sides, his feet cramped against the opposite door. His eyes were wide open. He lay there, watching chain lightning flash on the horizon. Finally, he let out a breath that sounded like all the breaths he'd ever taken out, going out at once, and he drew himself up. He got out and walked over to the restroom. Inside, white tiles and bare lights. His eyes felt raw, peeled. Finished, he washed his hands, but not his face. That would only make sleep more difficult. Outside again, and feeling desperately out of sync, he listened to his shoes falling hollowly on the cement. Next week, we've got to get organised. He said this, he was sure, because he heard his voice coming back to him, although with a peculiar empty resonance. Well, this time tomorrow night he would be home, and as unlikely as that seemed now. He stopped, bent for a drink from the water fountain. The footsteps did not stop. Now, wait, he thought, I'm pretty far gone, but... He swallowed, his ears popping. The footsteps stopped. Hell, he thought, I've been pushing too hard. She... No, it was my fault, my plan this time. To drive nights, sleep days, just so. As long as you can sleep. Easy, take it easy. He started walking again around the corner and back to the lot. At the corner, he thought he saw something move at the edge of his vision. He turned quickly to the right, in time for a fleeting glimpse of someone hurrying out of sight into the shadows. Well, the other side of the building housed the women's restroom. Maybe it was Evie. Wait a minute indeed. He glanced towards the car, but it was blocked from view. He walked on. Now the parking area resembled an oasis lit by firelight, or a western camp, the cars rimming the lot on three sides in the manner of wagons gathered against the night. Strength in numbers, he thought. Again, each car he passed looked at first like every other. It was the flat light, of course, and of course they were the same cars he'd seen half an hour ago, and the light still gave them a dusty, abandoned look. He touched a fender. It was dusty. But why shouldn't it be? His own car had taken on quite a layer of grime after so long on these roads. He touched the next car. The next. Each was so dirty that he could have carved his name without scratching the paint. He had an image of himself passing this way again. God forbid, a year from now, say, and finding these same cars parked here. The same ones. What if, he wondered tightly, what if some of these cars had been abandoned? Overheated, explode, broken down one fine midday and left here by the owners who simply never returned. Who would ever know? The highway patrol? Did anyone bother to check? Would an automobile be preserved here for months, years, by the elements like a snakeskin shed by the highway? It was a thought, anyway. His head was buzzing. He leaned back and inhaled deeply as he could at this altitude. But he did hear something, faint tapping. It reminded him of running feet, until he noticed the lamp overhead. There were hundreds of moths beating against the high fixture, their soft bodies tapping as they struck and circled and returned again and again to the lens. The light made their wings translucent. He took another deep breath and went onto his car. He could hear it ticking, cooling down before he got there. Idly, he rested a hand on the hood. Warm, of course, the tyres. He touched the left front. It was taut, hot as a loaf from the oven. When he took his hand away, the colour of the rubber came off on his palm like burned skin. He reached for the door handle. A moth fluttered down onto the fender. He flicked it off, his finger leaving a streak on the enamel. He looked closer and saw a wavy mottled pattern covering his unwashed car. And then he remembered the rain yesterday afternoon. The rain had left blotches in the dust, marking the finish as if with dirty fingerprints. He glanced over at the next car. It too had the imprint of dry raindrops, but close up he saw that the marks were superimposed in layers, over and over again. The Firebird had been through a great many rains. He touched the hood. Cold. He removed his hand, and a dead moth clung to his thumb. He tried to push it off on the hood, but other moth bodies stuck in its place. Then he saw countless shriveled, mummified moths pasted over the hood and top like peeling chips of paint. His fingers were coated with the powder from their wings. He looked up. High above, backed by banks of roiling cumulus clouds, the swarm of moths vibrated about the bright protective light. So the Firebird had been here a very long time. He wanted to forget it, to let it go. He wanted to get back in the car. He wanted to lie down, knock it out, everything. He wanted to go to sleep and wake up in Los Angeles. But he couldn't. He inched around the Firebird until he was facing the line of cars. He hesitated a beat and then started moving. A LeSabre, a Cougar, a Chevy van, a Corvair, a Ford, a Mustang, and every one was overlaid with grit. He paused by the Mustang. Once, how long ago, it had been a luminous candy apple red. Probably belonged to a teenager. Now the windshield was opaque, the body dulled to a peculiar shade he could not quite place. Feeling like a voyeur at a drive-in movie theatre, Maclay crept to the driver's window. Dimly, he perceived two large outlines in the front seat. He raised his hand. Wait, what if there were two people sitting there on the other side of the window, watching him? He put it out of his mind. Using 3 fingers, he cut a swathe through the scum on the glass and pressed close. The shapes were there, 2 headrests. He started to pull away, and happened to glance at the back seat. He saw a long, uneven form. A leg. The back of a thigh. Blonde hair streaked with shadows. The collar of a coat. And delicate and silvery, a spider web, spun between the hair and the collar. He jumped back. His leg struck the old Ford. He spun around, his arms straight. The blood was pounding in his ears. He rubbed out a spot on the window of the Ford and scanned the inside. The figure of a man slumped on the front seat. The man's head lay on a jacket. No, it was not a jacket, it was a large, formless stain. In the filtered light, Maclay could see that it had dried to a dark brown. It came from the man's mouth. No, not from the mouth. The throat had a long, thin slash across it, reaching nearly to the ear. He stood there stiffly, his back almost arched, his eyes jerking, trying not to close. The even light reflecting thinly from each windshield, the Corvair, the van, the Cougar, the LeSabre, the suggestion of a shape within each one. This would be a good time. Run, Maclay, run! Yes, this would be a time to leave as quickly as possible. The pulse in his ears muffled and finally blotted out the distant gearing of a truck up on the highway, the death rattle of the moths against the seductive lights. He reeled. He seemed to be hearing again the breaking open of doors and the scurrying of padded feet across paved spaces. He remembered the first time. He remembered the sound of a second door slamming into place where no new car but his own had arrived. Or had it been the door to his car slamming a second time after Evie had gotten back in? If so, how? Why? And there had been the sight of someone moving, trying to slip away. And for some reason now he remembered the Indian in the tourist town slipping out of sight in the doorway of that gift shop. He held his eyelids down until he saw the shop again, the window full of kachinas and tin gods and tapestries woven in secret language. And he remembered it clearly. The Indian had not been entering the store, he had been stealing away. Maclay did not understand what it meant, but he opened his eyes as if for the first time in centuries and began to run towards his car. If I could only catch my goddamn breath, he thought. He tried to hold on. He tried to not think of her, of what might have happened the first time, of what he may have been carrying in the back seat ever since. He had to find out. He fought his way back to the car against a riding tide of fear he could not stem. He told himself to think of other things, of things he knew he could control. Mileages and motel bills, time zones and weather reports, spare tyres and flares and tubeless repair tools, hydraulic jack and Windex and paper towels and tire iron and socket wrench and waffle cushion and traveller's checks and credit cards and dot kit, toothbrush and paste, deodorant, shaver, safety blade, brushless cream and sunglasses and sight savers and tear gas pen and fibre tip pens and portable radio and alkaline batteries and fire extinguisher and desert water bag and tyre gauge and motor oil and money belt with the identification sealed in plastic. In the back of his car under the quilt. Nothing moved. Not even when he finally lost his control and his mind in a thick, warm scream. That is, it only comes out at night. Which, as the author rightly points out, isn't strictly a vampire story, or you can't be certain, but it's certainly very atmospheric, especially if you've ever been on a road in Arizona. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break because I completely forgot to get any water, and now I am dry as a bone. So I will be back shortly, go stretch, do the things that you would normally do. I will hit the hydration, hit the content warnings again so they're in the chat. Feel free to play it with Dracula if you want to. It makes noises now. And I'll be back shortly. See you in a minute. And we're back. So we go from the hot and long interstates of Arizona to a pleasant home counties town in Peter Tremayne's Dracula's Chair. Peter Tremayne is the pseudonym of historian and Celticist Peter Beresford Ellis, who has published numerous works on Celtic history and cultures, including a Dictionary of Irish mythology, paperbacked by the Oxford University Press, and the companion volume A Dictionary of Celtic Mythology. As Tremayne, he has published 25 books in the horror and heroic fantasy genre, often concentrating on tales based on themes from Celtic mythology, such as the recent Island of Shadows. Although only a score of his short stories have appeared, they have been well received on both sides of the Atlantic, and translated into a dozen European languages. Peter Tremayne weaves no less engrossing tales than Edgar Allan Poe, says the Asbury Park Press. Dracula's Chair was only his third short story. It was originally written as an epilogue to his novel, The Revenge of Dracula, 1979. The second volume in his Dracula trilogy, which also includes Dracula Unborn, 1977, USA, Blood Right, and Dracula My Love, 1980. He decided to admit it on the grounds that it was artistic overkill. It's not wrong. Maybe this is an hallucination. Perhaps I am mad. How else can this be explained? I sit here alone and helpless, so utterly alone in an age which is not mine, in a body which is not mine. Oh God, I am slowly being killed, or worse. Yet what is worse than death? That terrifying limbo that is the borderland of hell, that state that is neither the restful sleep of death, nor the perplexities of life, but is the nightmare of undeath. He is draining me of life, and yet it is me who is the victim. Yet is it me who is the victim? How can I tell him that the person he thinks I am, the person whose body my mind inhabits, is no longer in that body? How can I tell him that I am in the body of his victim, I, a person from another time, another age, another place? God help me, he is draining me of life, and I cannot prevent him. When did this nightmare begin? An age away. I suppose it began when my wife and I saw The Chair. We were driving back to London one hot July Sunday afternoon, having been picnicking in Essex. We were returning about mid-afternoon down the A11 through the village of Newport. A lot of lorries on that these days. Now, I once got stuck on the A11 in a downpour. Just aquaplaning. It's funny how both these stories are about roads that I've been on. I've noticed that. When my wife suddenly called upon me to pull over and stop. I've just seen the most exquisite chair in the window of an antique shop. I was somewhat annoyed because I wanted to get home early that evening to see a vintage Humphrey Bogart film on the television, one I'd never seen before, even though I have been a Bogart fan for years. What's the point, I muttered grumpily, getting out of the car and trailing after her. The shop's shut anyway. But the shop wasn't shut. Passing trade on a Sunday from London was apparently very lucrative, and most antique shops in the area are open during the afternoons. Yes, the roads that Lou has travelled. An intermittent selection across the world. I should go on to one next in Italy. The chair stood like a lone sentinel in the window. It was a square in shape, a wooden straight-backed chair with sturdy arms. It was of a plain and simple design, dark oak wood, yet with none of the ornate woodwork that is commonly associated with such items. The seat was upholstered in a faded tapestry work, which was obviously the original. It was a very unattractive upholstery, for it was in a faded black with a number of once white exotic dragons' heads. The same upholstery was reflected in the piece, which provided a narrow backrest, a strip a foot deep thrust across the middle of the frame. My impression of the chair was hardly exquisite. It was a squat, ugly, and aggressive piece. Certainly it did not seem worth the £100 price ticket which was attached by a string to one arm. Please note that this was probably written in the late 80s or early 90s, and therefore £100 is actually quite a lot of money, whereas today it might be your shopping bill, which was attached by a string to one arm. My wife had contrary ideas. It was, she felt, exactly the right piece to fill a corner in my study and provide a spare chair for extra guests. It could, she assured me, easily be reupholstered to fit in with our general colour scheme of greens and golds. What was wanted, she said, was a functional chair, and this was it. She was adamant, and so I resigned myself to a minimum of grumbling, one eye on my watch to ensure I would not miss the Bogart film. The transaction was concluded fairly quickly by comparison with my wife's usual stand of detailed questioning and examination. Perhaps the vendor was rather more loquacious than the average antique dealer. "It's a very nice chair," said the dealer with a summoned enthusiasm. "It's a Victorian piece of Eastern European origin. Look, on the back you can see actually a date of manufacture and the place of origin." He pointed to the back of the chair, where carved into the wood with small letters was the word Bistritz, and the date 1887. I don't know if you recognise those things, that place and that date. You will know where it's from. The dealer smiled in the surety of knowledge. "That makes it Romanian in origin." Spoiler. Actually, I purchased the piece from the old Purfleet Art Gallery." "The Purfleet Art Gallery?" said I, thinking it time to make some contribution to the conservation. "Isn't that the old gallery and museum over which there were some protests a few months ago?" "Yeah, you know the place. Purfleet in Essex. The gallery was housed in an ancient building in a manor house called Carfax, which was said to date back to medieval times. The old gallery had been there since the late Victorian period, but it had to close through lack of government subsidies, and the building has been carved up into apartments." I nodded, feeling I had perhaps made too much of a contribution. The antique dealer went on obliviously. "When the gallery closed, a lot of its objects d'art were auctioned, and I bought this chair. According to the auctioneer's catalogue, it had been in the old house when the gallery first opened and belonged to the previous owner. He was said to have been a foreign nobleman, probably a Romanian by the workmanship of the chair." Finally, having had her fears assuaged over matters of woodwork, methods of upholstery and the like, and the purchase was concluded by my wife. The chair was strapped to the roof rack of my car, and we headed homewards. The next day was Monday. My wife, who was in research, had gone to her office, while I spent the morning in my study doodling on pieces of paper and vainly waiting for a new plot to mature for the television soap opera I was scripting at the time. At midday, my wife telephoned to remind me to check around for some price quotations for reupholstering our purchase. I had forgotten all about the chair, still wrapped in the roof rack of my car. Feeling a little guilty, I went down to the garage and untied it, carrying it up to my study and placing it in the allotted corner with a critical eye. I confess, I did not like the thing. It was so square, and seemed to somehow challenge me. It is hard to define what I mean, but you have, I suppose, seen certain types of people with thrust-out jaws, square and aggressive. Well, the chair gave this same impression. After a while, perhaps in response to its challenge, I decided to sit down in the chair, and as I sat, a sudden coldness spread up my spine, and a weird feeling of unease came over me. So strong was it that I immediately jumped up. I stood there looking down at the chair and feeling a trifle self-conscious. I laughed nervously. Ridiculous. What would my friend Philip, who was a psychiatrist, say to such behaviour? I did not like the chair, but there was no need to create physical illusions around my distaste. I sat down again, and as expected, the cold feelings of unease were gone, a mere shadow in my mind. In fact, I was surprised at the comfort of the chair. I sat well back, arms and hands resting on the wooden armrests, head leaning against the back, legs spread out. It was extremely comfortable. So comfortable was it that a feeling of deep relaxation came over me. With the relaxation came the desire to have a cat nap. I must confess, I tend to enjoy a 10-minute nap just after lunch. A very challenging chair, yes. It relaxes me and stimulates the mind. I sat back, closed my drooping eyelids, and gently let myself drift. It was dark when I awoke. For an instant I struggled with the remnants of my dreams. Then my mind cleared and I looked about me. My first thought was the question, how long had I slept? I could see the dark hue of early evening through the tall windows. Then I started, for there were no tall windows in my study, or anywhere in my house. Blinking my eyes rapidly to focus them in the darkened room, I abruptly perceived that I was not in my study, nor was I in any room that I had ever seen before. I tried to rise in my surprise and found I could not move. Some sluggish feeling in my body prevented me from coordinating my limbs. My mind had clarity and will, but below my neck the whole body seemed numb. And so I just sat there, staring wildly at the unfamiliar room in a cold sweat of fear and panic. I tried to blink away the nightmare, tried to rationalise. I could move my head around, and doing so, I found that I was sitting in the same chair. That accursed chair! Yet it seemed strangely newer than I remembered it. I thought perhaps it was a trick of the light, but I discovered that around my legs was tucked a woolen blanket, while the top half of me was clad in a pyjama jacket, over which was a velvet smoking jacket, a garment that I knew I had never owned. My eyes wandered around the room from object to unfamiliar object, each unfamiliar item causing the terror to mount in my veins, now surging with adrenaline. I was in a lounge filled with some fine pieces of Victoriana. He's like, I'm trapped in the past in a terrible chair, but gosh, look at these fine pieces of Victoriana. It's just splendid woodwork. And also, ah! The chair in which I sat now stood before an open hearth, in which a few coals faintly glimmered. In one corner stood a lean, tall grandfather clock, whose steady tick-tock added to the oppressiveness of the scene. There was, so far as I could see, nothing modern in the room at all. But for me, the greatest horror was the strange paralysis which kept me anchored in that chair. I tried to move until the sweat poured from my face with the effort. I even tried to shout, opening my mouth wide to emit strange, choking-like noise. What in God's name had happened to me? Suddenly, a door opened. Into the room came a young girl of about 17, holding aloft one of those old brass oil lamps, the sort you see converted into electric lamp these days by trendy people. Yet, this was no converted lamp, but a lamp from which the flames sputtered and emitted the odour of burning paraffin. Yes, let me tell you about my surroundings. Very pleasant, apart from the horrifying paralysis. Oh, and here's a random girl. And the girl, she wore a long black dress with a high-button collar with a light linen apron over it. Her fair hair was tucked inside a small white cap set at a jaunty angle on her head. In fact, she looked like a serving maid straight out of one of those Victorian drama serials we get so often on the television these days. Oh, period drama. She came forward and placed the lamp on a table near me, and then started, seeing my eyes wide open and upon her. I tried to speak to her, to demand, to extort some explanation, to ask what the meaning of this trickery was, but only a strangled gasp came from my throat. The girl was clearly frightened and bobbed what was supposed to be a curtsy in my direction before turning to the door. "Mum! Mum!" Her strong Cockney accent made the word sound like mum. "Master's awake, Mum. What'll I do?" Another figure moved into the room, tall, graceful, wearing an elegant Victorian dress, hung low at the shoulders and leaving very little of her bust to the imagination. Howay, lad. A black ribbon with a cameo was fastened to her pale throat. Her raven black hair was done up in a bun at the back of her head. Her face was small, heart-shaped and pretty. The lips were naturally red, though a trifle sullen for her features. The eyes were deep green and seemed a little sad. She came towards me, bent over me, and gave a wan smile. There was a strange, almost unnatural pallor to her complexion. You may have sat in a cursed time-travelling chair. That's all, Fanny, she said. I'll see to him now. Yes, Mum. The girl bobbed another curtsy and was gone through the door. Poor Upton, whispered the woman before me. Poor Upton. I wish I knew whether you hurt at all. No one seems to know from what strange malady you suffer. She stood back and sighed sorrowfully and deeply. It's time for your medication. She picked up a bottle and a spoon, pouring a bitter-smelling amber liquid, which she forced down my throat. I felt a numbing bitterness searing down my gullet. Poor Upton, she sighed again. It's bitter, I know, but the doctor says it will take away any pain. I tried to speak, tried to tell her that I was not Upton, that I did not want her medicine, that I wanted this play-acting to cease. I succeeded only in gnashing my teeth and making inarticulate cries like some wild beast at bay. The woman took a step backwards, her eyes widening in fright. Then she seemed to regain her composure. Come, Upton, she chided. This won't do at all. Do try to relax. The girl, Fanny, reappeared. Dr. Seward is here, Mum. A stocky man in a brown tweed suit, with a very familiar name, looking like some character out of a Dickens novel, stepped into the room and bowed over the woman's proffered hand. John, smiled the woman, I'm so glad you've come. How are you, Clara? Smiled the man. You look a trifle weary, a little pale. I'm all right, John, but I do worry about Upton. The man turned to me. Yes, how is the patient? I swear he looks a little more alert today. The woman, Clara, spread her hands and shrugged. To me, he seems a little better, John. Even when he seems more alert physically, he can only growl like a beast. I try my best, but I fear that... The man called John patted her hand and gestured her to silence. Then he came and bent over me with a friendly smile. Strange, he murmured. Indeed, a strange affliction. And yet I do detect a more intelligent gleam in the eyes today. Hello, old friend, you know me. It's John Stewart. Do you recognise me? I really must protest about this time-travelling nonsense, and I would like to speak to the manager. He leaned close to my face, so close I could smell the scent of oranges on his breath. Oranges. Read. I struggled to break the paralysis which gripped me, and only succeeded in issuing a number of snarls and grunts. The man drew back. On my word, Clara, has he been violent at all? Not really, John. He does excite himself so with visitors. But perhaps it's his way of trying to communicate with us? The man grunted and nodded. Well, the only remedy for pain is to keep dosing him with the laudanum as I prescribed it. Now, if I remember, the laudanum contains various things like morphine and alcohol, and is quite fun by the sound of it, and also regularly lethal. And extremely addictive. I think he is a little better. However, I shall call again tomorrow to see if there's significant improvement. If not, I will ask your permission to consult a specialist, perhaps a doctor from Harley Street. There are a number of factors that still puzzle me. His anemia, the apparent lack of red blood corpuscles or hemoglobin. Well, the hemoglobin is in the red blood corpuscles, so those two would be missing, yes, together. His paleness and languor, and these strange wounds on his neck do not seem to be healing at all. The woman bit her lip and lowered her voice. You may be frank with me, John. You have known Upton and me for some years now. I am resigned to the fact that there can only be a worsening of his condition. I do fear for his life. The man glanced at me nervously. Should you talk like this in front of him? The woman sighed. He cannot understand, of that I am sure. Poor Upton. Just to think that a few short days ago he was so full of life, so active, and now this strange disease has cut him down. The man nodded. You have been a veritable goddess, Clara, Charity herself nursing him constantly day and night. I shall look in again tomorrow, but if there's no improvement, I shall seek permission to call in a specialist. Clara lowered her head as if in resignation. The man turned to me and forced a smile. So long, old fellow. I tried to call desperately, tried to plead for help. And then he was gone. The minutes dragged into hours as the woman Clara, who was supposed to be my wife, sat gazing into the fire while I sat pinioned in my accursed chair opposite to her. How long we sat thus I do not truly know. From time to time I felt her gaze, and sad and thoughtful upon me. Then I became aware somewhere in the house of a clock commencing to strike. A few seconds later it was followed by the resonant and hollow sound of the grandfather clock. Without raising my head, I counted slowly to 12. Midnight. The woman Clara abruptly sprang from her chair and stood upright before the fire. As I looked up, she seemed to change slightly. It is hard to explain. Her face started to grow coarser and more bloated. Her tongue, a red, glistening object, darted nervously over her lips, making them moist and of a deeper red than before, contrasting starkly to the sharp whiteness of her teeth. A strange lustre began to sparkle in her eyes. She raised a languid hand and began to massage her neck slowly, sensually. Then abruptly she laughed, a low, voluptuous chuckle that made the hairs on my neck bristle. She glanced down at me with a wanton expression, a lascivious smile. Howie. Poor Upton. Her tone was a gloating caress. He'll be coming soon. You'll like that, won't you? Yet why he takes you first, I cannot understand. Why you? Am I not full of the warmth of life? Does not warm, rich, young blood flow in my veins? Why you? She made an obscene, seductive gesture with her body. The way she crooned, the saliva trickling from a corner of those red, oh so red lips, made my heart beat faster. Yet at the same time the blood seemed to deny its very warmth and pump like some ice-cold liquid in my veins. What new nightmare was this? How he appeared, I do not know. 1 minute there was just the woman and myself in the room. Then he was standing there. A tall man, apparently elderly, though his pale face held no aging of the skin. Only the long white moustache, which drooped over his otherwise clean-shaven face, gave the impression of age. His face was strong, extremely strong, aquiline with a high-bridged nose and peculiarly arched nostrils. His forehead was loftily domed, and hair grew scantily around the temples, but profusely elsewhere. The eyebrows were massive and nearly met across the bridge of the nose. It was his mouth that captured my attention, a mouth set in the long, pale face, fixed and cruel-looking, with teeth that had protruded over the remarkably ruddy lips, whose redness had the effect of highlighting his white skin, and giving the impression of an extraordinary pallor. And where the teeth protruded over the lips, they were white and sharp. His eyes seemed a ghastly red in the glow of the flickering fire. The woman, Clara, took a step towards him, hands out as if imploring, a wild, glad cry on her red, wanton lips, her breasts heaving as if with some wild ecstasy. Breasts heaving! "My lord," she cried, "you have come!" The tall man ignored her. His red eyes were upon mine, seeming to devour me. The woman raised a hand to massage her throat. "Lord, take me first. Take me now." The tall man took a stride towards me, drawing back an arm and pushing her roughly aside. "It is he that I shall take first," he said, sibilantly, with a strange accent to his English. "You shall wait your turn, which shall be in a little while." The woman made to protest, but he stopped her with an upraised hand. "Dare you question me?" he said mildly. "Have no fear. You shall be my bountiful wine-press in a little while. But first I shall slake my thirst with him." He towered over me as I remained helpless in that chair, that accursed chair. A smile edged his face. "Is it not just," whispered the tall man, "is it not just that having thwarted me, you, Upton Welsford, now become everything that you abhorred and feared?" And while part of my mind was witnessing this obscene hallucination, wanton gestures and heaving breasts, yes. While part of my mind was witnessing this obscene hallucination, another part of it began to experience a strange excitement, almost a sexual excitement, as the man lowered his face to mine. Suddenly gay. Splendid. Closer came those awful red eyes to gaze deep into my soul. His mouth was open slightly. I could smell a vile reek of corruption. There was a deliberate voluptuousness about his movements that was both thrilling and appalling. He licked his lips like some animal, the scarlet tongue flickering over the sharp white teeth. Lower came his head, lower, until it passed from my sight, and I could hear the churning sound of his tongue against his teeth. I could feel his hot breath on my neck. The skin of my throat began to tingle, and I felt the soft, shivering touch of his cold lips on my throat, and the hard indent of two sharp white teeth. For a while, how long I could not measure, I seemed to fall into a languorous ecstasy. Then he was standing above me, smiling down sardonically, a trickle of blood on his chin. My blood. "There is one more night to feast with him," he said softly. "One night more, and then, Upton Wilford, you shall be my brother." The woman exclaimed in anger, "But you promised! You promised! When am I to be called?" The tall man turned and laughed. "Aye, I promised, my slender vine. You already bear my mark. You belong to me. You will be one with me, never fear. Immortality will soon be yours, and we shall share in the drinking. You will provide me with the wine of life. Have patience, for the greatest wines are long in the savouring, and I shall return." Then, to my horror, the man was gone, simply gone, as if he had dissolved into elemental dust. For some time I sat in horror, staring at the woman who seemed to have retreated into a strange trance. Then the grandfather clock began to chime, and the woman started as if waking from a deep sleep. She stared in amazement at the clock, and then towards the window, where the faint light of early dawn was beginning to show. "Good Lord, Upton," she exclaimed. We seem to have been up all night. I must have fallen asleep, I'm sorry." She shook herself. "I had a strange dream. Ah, well, no matter. I'd better get you up to bed. I'll go and wake poor Fanny to help me." She smiled softly at me as she left the room. There was no trace of the wanton seductress left on her delicate features. She left me sitting alone in my prison of a chair. I sit here alone and helpless, so utterly alone. Alone in an age which is not mine, in a body which is not mine. Oh God, I am slowly being killed, or worse. Yet what is worse than death? That terrifying limbo that is the borderland of hell. That state that is neither the restful sleep of death, nor the perplexities of life, but is the nightmare of undeath. And where is this person, the Upton Welsford whose body I now inhabit? Where is he? Has he, by some great effort of will, exchanged his body with mine? Is he even now awakening from that catnap sometime in the future? Awakening in my body, in my study, to resume my life? Is he doing even as I have done? What does it all mean? Maybe this is an hallucination. Perhaps I am mad. How else can all this be explained? And that is the end of Dracula's Chair by Peter Tremayne. Those ones are a bit shorter, so it looks like I'm done with about an hour. Next week, if I double check my Booko notes, which is the wrong way up. Next week's will be Melanie Tem, The Better Half, and an episode of Cathedral History by M.R. James. Good old M.R. James. Author of, I think, the author of Count Magnus, if memory serves correctly. I've read it before on this channel. So yes, those will be the two for next week. Next week? No, 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks from now, because I play D&D on the alternate weekends. So yes, in 2 weeks' time, all being well, presuming I'm not LARPing or something like that, I will read those too. I hope you have enjoyed these Dracula's Chair, and it only comes out at night in a deserted road in Arizona. Have a good week. Look after yourselves, and remember, good night out there, whatever you are.